I'm going to be looking at different accounts of moral responsibility. That is, the situations in which one can and should be held morally responsible for something that they've done. And I'm following along with John Martin Fisher and Mark Revizza, who provides an overview of these various approaches. So first of all, let's think about it. What are the conditions of moral responsibility? Now, without going into my answer or the full answer, let's talk about a common view. A very commonly held view is that having free will is necessary for moral responsibility, that there is a connection between free will and moral responsibility, such that if you are morally responsible, then you have free will. And if you don't have free will, in your action. So if somebody forced you to do something, then you're not morally responsible for doing it. But if you have free will, then it makes sense that you could hold somebody morally responsible. But you should note here, the merely having free will does not imply that you actually have moral responsibilities, because there are other things of concern. Let's just focus, though, on this connection between having more responsibility and that implying that we have free will. Moral responsibility then involves two abilities at the least. One is, since we're talking about morality here, you have to have this capacity to do something that is morally good or bad or right or wrong, depending on how you might frame the situation. And then you also have the capacity to have the right kind of control over your actions and the outcome of one's actions, at least one of those two things. So that's where the free will comes in. If you are morally responsible, we know you have these two capacities, and we're focusing on this second capacity, this having control over your actions and the free will involved there. So, what do people have to say about this? First of all, the principle of alternative possibilities is a commonly held principle, and it is assumed that one holds this principle also appeals to libertarian freedom. Libertarian freedom being the idea that one can do one action or can do a different action or refrain from doing that particular action. So there has to be these open paths, so to speak, in front of you that you can take, and then you can look back and we can talk about a person being able to have done otherwise. So this is what we call the principle of alternative possibilities. The idea, when we connect it to moral responsibility, is a person is morally responsible for what they've done only if he could have done otherwise. And I'm using Harry Frankfurt's specific wording here. And so this is what we might call the original principle of alternative possibilities, although oddly, he called it the principle of alternate possibilities. Anyway, henceforth, we've called it alternative possibilities. Now, there are many, many other versions that have been proposed, many, many tweaks to address concerns that have been raised. But this is the rough idea, that you're morally responsible for something only if you had that libertarian freedom, only if you could have done something else, or you could have refrained from doing that thing. Now, John Martin Fisher and Mark Revizza, that's the F and R, they're skeptical about this principle. And their skepticism comes from what has come to be called Frankfurt-style examples. So these are examples from Harry Frankfurt. So I have a video on Frankfurt describing these in great detail and how he developed them. So you might want to look at that video. I'm calling these FSEs, right? Frankfurt-style examples. But Uh, I know there's a lot of text on this page. This is Frankfurt's initial uh, description of a Frankfurt style. Well, it's not his first one. It's his first developed description of a Frankfurt style example. So we have the situation, and let's put in for X and Y. Let's just put in, I guess we only need an X here. Let's say it's voting for the Republican candidate. So Black wants Jones to vote Republican, but he doesn't want to reveal his intentions. So Black wants to remain in the shadows, so to speak. So he waits until Jones is deciding about whether to vote Republican, and he doesn't do anything unless it's clear Jones is not going to vote Republican. Now, if Jones is going to decide not to vote Republican, then Black's going to step in. Then Black's going to take steps to ensure that Jones does vote for Republican. Now, how Black does this can be science fiction. It doesn't matter. You know, maybe he has some neural controls on Jones. So whatever Jones is inclined to do, Black will have his way, right? So either Jones is going to do X on his own, or Black assures that Jones will do X anyway, and we're saying that's voting for Republican in this scenario. Now, suppose Black does nothing. So Black doesn't intervene. He could have, but he didn't, because Jones goes ahead and votes Republican. So Jones initiated voting Republican, and he's morally responsible for voting Republican, yet he could not have done otherwise. So this is Frankfurt's rationale for rejecting that principle of alternative possibilities. So Frankfurt says you don't have to have the ability to do otherwise to be held morally responsible. Now, let's go on and consider how various people have responded to this claim of Frankfurt. And first, it makes sense that we would consider Frankfurt's own response to his Frankfurt-style examples. And ultimately, this is what Frankfurt does. He presents a hierarchical model of moral responsibility. And in order to consider this, you have to think about levels of desire. So we have a first-order desire, these are the desires we have that motivate an action. So if you have a desire for ice cream and that leads you to a trip to the Dairy Queen, or you have a desire to be healthy and that leads you to exercise, right? So these desires motivate the actions. You desire to do well in a class and understand the material, so that leads you to attend the class and study the material. But there are also second-order desires. Second-order desires are the directions on what one wants to have as their first-order desires. So maybe there's a desire for ice cream that would lead you to a trip to the Dairy Queen, but you have a second-order desire to be more healthy and to not eat the ice cream. Right? And so that might influence whether or not you have that desire for the ice cream after all. Now, if there's a conformity between one's first order desires and one's second order desires, and those are of a higher order, then one is morally responsible for what one does. Notice this does not include any concerns about having an ability to do otherwise. As long as you are acting in a way that your first order desire, so somebody has a desire for ice cream, they're going to go to the Dairy Queen, and their second order desire is, yes, I think it's a good thing to treat myself, so that's fine having this desire for ice cream, and that everything's conformed, then you're morally responsible for what you do. Now, that could be consistent, notice, with Black voting Republican. He may have had a first order and second order desire lined up. I'm sorry, Jones is the one voting Republican, but Black wants him to, and Black doesn't have to step in, and Jones could still be held morally responsible, even though he doesn't have any alternative. Okay, so the way out for Frankfurt then is the idea that although one may not be free, that is, they don't have libertarian freedom, they're not free to do otherwise within the context of a Frankfurt style example, one is still free to order one's desires in some circumstances at least. Now, here I might add, if you're concerned about determinism, or, have them ordered, or maybe one could still be morally responsible under the circumstances when someone outside or an inanimate force outside the individual is ordering their desires, and they still would be morally responsible. Well, in any case, Frankfurt does say it's consistent with determinism that you're morally responsible. And Frankfurt develops this idea of ordering desires with the concept of identification. This is how it occurs for Frankfurt. Ultimately, a person is morally responsible for what she has done if and only if there's an unopposed desire. So everything's lining up. The higher order desires, if there are more than two, all of them are lining up with that first order desire to act in accordance with that motivating first order desire. Everything's lining up. Further reflection also is not going to issue in any difference in action, so it's going to result in the same decision. If that's the case, if that's what's going on, Frankfurt says we have somebody that's morally responsible. So person's morally responsible when, under what conditions? When they have an unopposed desire to act in accordance with the motivating first order desire, and they are settled on that. Further reflection isn't going to change that. Notice again, of course, no mention of an ability to do otherwise, and it seems that moral responsibility could be consistent with determinism. All right, that's Harry Frankfurt's approach and response. Let's consider another response, and that's the one of Eleanor Stump. Stump doesn't like Frankfurt's suggestion that you have this hierarchical model that has to be the key to moral responsibility. So her concerns are twofold. One is that the process of identification could be directed by an external source. This is what I was suggesting previously. So maybe a person is brainwashed to have these higher order desires lining up with these lower order desires, or some kind of hypnosis that allows their psychological structure to be in unified a situation to act a certain way. And in those cases, it doesn't seem like the person should be held morally responsible for doing what they did, but rather the person who was doing the brainwashing or the hypnosis. Another concern that Stump has is there seems to be too much emphasis on the higher order volitions over the lower order volitions. Both of them are a part of the person. And so why favor one over the other when we're talking about moral responsibility? Now, what Stump does in response, and I cannot go into detail here, we need to move on to other views, is she modifies his account. She gives a support for favoring reason, not desires. She focuses on reason. And when reason directs the will as pursuing the good, and the reason is able to evaluate what is good clearly, when that's the primary source of the identification of the desires, then one is to be held morally responsible. So one other person who takes an approach somewhat similar to Stump, but definitely some distinctions here, is Susan Wolf. She also presents a completely non-hierarchical model. And I have actually two videos on Wolf Part 1 and Part 2. And you could explore what Wolf has to say about that in those videos. And her idea, again, focuses on reasons. What are the reasons for acting in a certain way rather than desire? So that's similar to Stump, even though it's the same view. All right. What about Fisher and Revisa themselves, the ones who are describing these various accounts of moral responsibility? What they do, and I'm not going to go through their whole detail because I have a couple videos on them as well, so you can find the videos about them elsewhere. They emphasize a mechanism that is reasons responsive. Now, a problem that they suggest is how responsive does one's reason have to be? So the idea is you have some kind of mechanism in your action that drives your action, and that mechanism has to be responsive to a reason to do something else or a reason to do what you're doing. And weak responsiveness is the idea that any old reason at all would have given them an excuse or reason not to do what they're doing, but that doesn't seem to be enough to warrant moral responsibility. So they describe cases there that seem problematic. Strong responsiveness, and they describe that as if you have any reason to do something, you have to be able to identify that reason, right? You have to be able to be aware of that reason and act according to it, but that's demanding too much, and then you wouldn't be held morally responsible in that situation because it's just demanding too much. So they settle on what they call moderate reasons responsiveness. Again, see the videos on Fisher and Revisa that go through those ultimate views of theirs. And moderate responsiveness is the idea roughly, again, not the person is not merely responsive to any reason at all, or only to one very specific odd reason, but they are responsive to some reasons. And you have to take into consideration the history of the individual when evaluating whether or not they should be held morally responsible. So that is a significant concern, that history of the individual. There are other responses to the Frankfurt style examples that are intended to show that the principle of alternative possibilities is false. And my approach is to carefully individuate events or one's actions, and then you have this flicker of freedom. That's not my phrase. That's Fisher's phrase to Frankfurt-style examples. So the Frankfurt-style examples, I was talking about voting, but when they were first introduced, there was always somebody going to shoot somebody else. So there seems to be that there would be two particular events. Jones shooting because Black intervened, or Jones shooting of his own accord, right? And those seem to be two very different things to me, two very different actions. And in the first case, what Jones was going to do was refrain from shooting someone, and then Black intervened. So it seems to me that if you know all those details, you don't hold Jones morally responsible in that situation. So we don't have a reason to say that the principle of alternative possibilities is false. And however, I surprisingly was unable to convince everyone that this is the right path to go, and Fisher and Revisa don't think this is the right path to go. They say it's hard to see how such a small, little tiny flicker of freedom could ground moral responsibility, especially when the alternative is not taken. So somebody shoots of their own accord, but they had this tiny little option of not choosing to shoot of their own accord and forcing Black's hand. Well, of course, I'm going to have to make a video about my own view on this to explain that more thoroughly and why I don't think that problem is an overwhelming problem. So what Fisher says, and of course Fisher and Revizza say together, is that you need to focus on the actual sequence of events, not alternative possibilities. I say no, alternative possibilities are important. Okay, one other approach that I think is worthwhile mentioning here to these Frankfurt-style examples that reject the principle of alternative possibilities. So notice that my view was the only view that said, no, we should hold on to the principle of alternative possibilities, that I still think, maybe with some rewording, that it's true. Everyone else that I've considered here is rejecting it. And another reason to reject it is from Peter Strawson. His rejection is very different. He argues that moral responsibility is constituted by attributions of reactive attitudes by a community, that moral responsibility is merely when you have a community who holds somebody responsible, who has a certain attitude towards the person when they've done something, whether that be good or bad. And that's all that moral responsibility is. So there's no further metaphysical requirement at all. And Strawson does that and doesn't worry about metaphysics in his approach to moral responsibility. He says that's all there is to moral responsibility. Now, one problem that I would mention here for Strawson's view is, if that's all there is, you cannot really criticize the practices of the community, because the community decides how one should be held morally responsible. And it's the community that might affirm something that everyone else knows is outside the community is wrong, is bad, right? So that seems to be problematic to me, at least. Of course, not to Strawson. Anyway, go check out those other videos if you want more information on any of the individuals that I've mentioned.